I'm Claudia Polsky, and I'm an assistant professor of law at UC Berkeley Law School, where I direct its environmental law clinic. In our existing economy, our national chemicals regulations fail us at every turn, and the evidence is in physical conditions all around us. We have drinking water contaminated by dry cleaning solvents and automotive fuel additives. We have levels of pesticide in the ambient environment capable of making frogs hermaphrodites or make them grow an extra leg. And we have newborns that are born with as many as 200 synthetic chemicals in their umbilical cord blood. Infants that are essentially born pre-polluted. And the worst part is that the situation arises less from violations of our existing chemicals law than from their ordinary operation. They're simply woefully underprotective. The problems aren't exactly the same across all our national chemicals laws. There's some that are unique to each of our laws. Our industrial chemicals law, TSCA, our pesticide law, our law governing the inclusion of chemicals in food, drug, and cosmetic products, and so on. But there are 5 fundamental flaws that these laws share. One is what I'd call a data gap. And that's that there is very little data about toxicity or exposure required before manufacturers can bring a chemical to market or before a product manufacturer can include that chemical in their product. And this runs directly counter to the expectations of the ordinary consumer that if something's offered for sale on store shelves, the government has in some reasonably robust fashion vetted it for safety. The second gap we have is a gap in safety, which is really a gap between the amount of protection one might expect and the amount of protection from toxics our laws deliver. There are a number of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that many of our chemicals laws incorporate variations on cost-benefit tests in which we weigh the benefit to private parties of using toxic chemicals against the cost to human health and the environment for the general public. So that's really comparing apples and oranges. The third problem we have, and a lot of my work is in this area, is what I would call a transparency gap. We have very minimal requirements for disclosure of ingredients in products in the marketplace. So if we take a fabricated article, like let's say a roof tile, there is very little composition information available to a purchaser other than the things that are visually evident, like it's made of clay or it's made of metal. If you take a formulated product like a pesticide or a floor cleaner, there's likewise very, very little information available about product composition. So let me build out the implications of that a little bit using the example of pesticide. Let's say you work for a highway department and you want to apply herbicide to the verge of a highway which is covered with weeds. But you want to avoid using any herbicide that would cause water pollution because the highway is adjacent to a river. Well, you're completely out of luck because U.S. pesticide law only requires disclosure of the active ingredient that kills the target, here the weeds, and has no regard for any of the other ingredients' toxicity. What's in the surfactant, what's in the preservative, what's in the colorant, you have absolutely no idea. Those things will likely be grouped on the product label as 99% other ingredients. In addition to these problems with data and safety and transparency, there's a problem with knowledge, and this is a big problem. We have made a systemic underinvestment in developing the sustainable materials professionals in universities, in the private sector, who can come up with the green chemistry and green engineering solutions that we need to make less toxic products. And the final problem I see across all of our chemicals laws is what I would call a vision gap, and it's really most fundamental. It's that every law we have is aimed at minimizing the harm from individual chemicals and products one by one. There's not a single federal law we have that articulates a goal of a safer materials economy, much less contains the mechanics to get us there. In a circular economy, the kinds of regulatory problems we're talking about not only remain relevant, they're all amplified. So, for example, the lack of information about product's chemical composition is an even greater problem if we intend to reuse constituents of a product in a next use cycle rather than to just landfill that product. And similarly, if we've done a risk assessment that contemplates a very specific use of a chemical in a particular product application, and then we reincarnate those materials for a different use, that risk assessment becomes completely irrelevant. We need large-scale regulatory changes if we're going to move towards a more circular economy. We need an affirmative vision of what a circular economy looks like with respect to technical material flows, the flows of those materials that are potentially toxic and we need to segregate from biological systems in perpetuity, and a vision of what we want to do with our biological materials flows, those things that can be composted and are reasonably benign, bio-based, and so forth. And then we need to reduce that vision to a set of specific design principles. And once we have these design principles articulated, we need to embed requirements and incentives in our laws so that our laws move us towards this design frame. And the final thing we have to do is we have to establish quantitative goals for toxics reduction. So we need a big vision and we need quantitative targets so that we can move towards a circular economy. What I've described sounds like a very broken system, and I know I've made a bleak assessment, but I am actually optimistic about where we might get with sufficient effort. And it's helpful to remember that just a dozen years ago, phrases like carbon neutral or zero waste sounded like a Martian lexicon to non-specialists, and now these are part of our everyday conversation and newspaper coverage. I was really heartened that in Pope Francis's recent encyclical, he talked about the need to, quote, adopt a circular model of production capable of preserving resources for present and future generations. I didn't necessarily expect that the Pope would outstrip our federal environmental agencies in embracing the circular economy, but I'll take it. Anything that gets the vocabulary of circularity into the public conversation is a good start. And then we need to do the hard work of making our laws match our words.